welcome to Tales in the Dark. I know many of you enjoy relaxing with these videos, so I recommend turning down the volume until my voice is barely audible. It'll make the experience even more soothing. Before you close your eyes, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and enjoy listening. Story 1. The old house had always held secrets, but none quite as intriguing as the room at the end of the third-floor hallway. Growing up there, I never questioned why that particular door remained perpetually locked, its brass handle collecting dust year after year. The dark wooden door stood quietly, patiently, like a sentinel guarding something precious, or perhaps something meant to be forgotten. I returned to the house after inheriting it from my grandmother, who had lived there alone for the past 20 years. The familiar creak of the front door welcomed me home, along with the gentle scent of old books and cedar wood that had always permeated the air. Soft afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, creating delicate patterns on the worn hardwood floors. Each step I took stirred up memories, like dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The house felt different now, quieter, more contemplative. The silence wasn't oppressive, but rather seemed to invite reflection, like the hushed atmosphere of an ancient library. As I moved through the rooms, running my fingers along the familiar wallpaper, I could almost hear echoes of past conversations, distant laughter, and the subtle whispers of family gatherings long gone. In the kitchen, everything remained exactly as I remembered. The old copper kettle on the stove, the collection of teacups in the glass cabinet, each one telling its own story through chips and wear patterns. The window above the sink still offered the same view of the garden, though the rose bushes had grown wild and untamed in recent years. A gentle breeze carried the sweet fragrance of wild flowers through the slightly opened window, mixing with the underlying scent of aged wood and memories. As evening approached, I began the task of sorting through my grandmother's belongings. In her desk drawer, I found an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and delicate with age. As I carefully turned the pages, a small brass key slipped out, landing softly on the carpet. It looked ancient, with intricate patterns carved into its head, the kind of key that belonged in a fairy tale rather than a modern home. That night, as rain began to tap gently against the windows, I found myself drawn to the third floor. The old stairs groaned softly beneath my feet, each step accompanied by the gentle percussion of raindrops. The hallway stretched before me, illuminated only by the warm glow of my lamp and occasional flashes of distant lightning that sent shadows dancing across the walls. The locked door stood at the end of the hall, exactly as it had throughout my childhood. The key felt heavy in my pocket, almost as if it were pulling me forward. As I approached, I noticed something I'd never seen before, a faint, warm light seeming to escape from beneath the door. It was so subtle that I might have imagined it, like the afterimage of a dream upon waking. The rain continued its gentle symphony as I stood before the door, studying its weathered surface. Traces of old paint revealed its history. Layers of white, then blue, then the current deep mahogany. The brass handle reflected my lamp's light, throwing warm spots onto the walls. I held my breath as I inserted the key into the lock, feeling the mechanism's resistance, years of disuse making it reluctant to turn. When the lock finally clicked, the sound seemed to echo through the entire house. The door opened with surprising smoothness, not a single creak or groan. The room beyond was bathed in a soft, diffused light that seemed to have no source. It was perfectly square, with walls covered in faded blue wallpaper, decorated with delicate silver patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The room contained only 3 items: a full-length mirror in one corner, its frame carved with intricate vines and leaves, a small round table in the center, its surface inlaid with mother of pearl, and a single chair, upholstered in fabric that appeared to change color as I moved around it, like oil on water. But what struck me most was the feeling within the room, a profound sense of peace mixed with an underlying current of something just beyond understanding. The air felt different here, lighter somehow, as if the normal rules of the world held less sway. The rain outside seemed more distant, its rhythm transformed into a gentle lullaby. As I stepped further into the room, I noticed that my reflection in the mirror wasn't quite synchronized with my movements. It followed a fraction of a second behind, like an echo of motion rather than a true reflection. When I stopped moving, I could have sworn I saw my reflection continue for just a moment longer before settling into stillness. On the table lay a single envelope, the paper pristine despite the years the room had remained sealed. My name was written on it in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. Inside was a letter, dated just days before she passed away. The words seemed to shift on the page as I read them, but the message remained clear. This room existed between moments, she wrote, a space where time moved differently. She had discovered it by accident in her youth and had spent years studying its peculiarities. According to her letter, the room appeared differently to each person who entered it. Some saw a library filled with books that had never been written. Others found an empty room with windows that looked out onto impossible landscapes. For her, it had always been a garden in perpetual spring, filled with flowers that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. As I read this, I became aware of subtle changes in the room around me. The wallpaper patterns were definitely moving now, forming and reforming into new designs. The light seemed to pulse gently, like a distant heartbeat. When I looked up from the letter, I noticed that the chair had changed position slightly, though I hadn't heard it move. I spent what felt like hours in that room, though when I later checked my watch, only minutes had passed. I watched as the mirror's reflection showed scenes from my childhood, moments I had forgotten, playing out like movies from another life. The table's pearl inlays swirled and danced, forming maps to places that couldn't exist. Sometimes I thought I could hear voices, not frightening or threatening, but familiar and comforting, like half-remembered conversations from dreams. They spoke in whispers just below the threshold of understanding, their words carrying the weight of important secrets just beyond my grasp. When I finally left the room, closing the door softly behind me, I felt changed in some subtle but fundamental way. The key seemed warmer in my hand, and I could have sworn it had changed shape slightly, though when I looked directly at it, it appeared exactly as it had before. In the weeks that followed, I often found myself standing in the third-floor hallway, key in hand, contemplating another visit to the room. Sometimes I would enter, finding it slightly different each time, the light a new shade, the mirror showing different reflections, the table's patterns telling new stories. Other times I would simply stand outside, feeling the gentle pulse of whatever magic it contained seeping out from under the door. I never showed the room to anyone else, though many visitors to the house remarked on the strange warmth they felt when passing by that hallway. Some would pause, cocking their heads as if hearing distant music, before continuing on their way. Children especially seemed drawn to the door, often stopping to press their palms against its surface, smiling at some secret only they could perceive. My grandmother's letter had ended with a warning that wasn't really a warning. The room will show you what you need to see when you need to see it. But remember, some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, their power lying not in their solution, but in their contemplation. Now, years later, I still visit the room regularly, though less frequently than in those first few months. Sometimes I sit in the color-changing chair and watch the mirror's reflections of might-have-beens and never-weres. Sometimes I study the table's shifting patterns, trying to memorize the maps to impossible places. And sometimes I simply stand in the center of the room, eyes closed, feeling the gentle pulse of whatever force keeps this space suspended between moments. The rain still falls outside, the house still creaks and settles, and the room at the end of the third-floor hallway continues to guard its secrets. But now I understand that some questions don't need answers, and some doors are meant to remain mostly closed, opened only in those quiet moments when we need to be reminded that the world is more mysterious and beautiful than we imagine. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the garden, I think I can hear the room calling, not with words, but with a feeling, a gentle tugging at the edges of consciousness. It reminds me that there are spaces between spaces, moments between moments, and that magic still exists in the world if we only know where to look for it. The key remains in my desk drawer, waiting for those moments when the ordinary world feels too solid, too defined, and the room remains at the end of the hallway, neither fully here nor fully elsewhere, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than understood, felt rather than explained. As I write these words, I can feel the gentle pulse of the room's presence above me, like a second heartbeat in the house. And I know that tonight, when the world grows quiet and the shadows long, I'll climb those creaking stairs once again, key in hand, ready to discover what new secrets the never-entered room has to share. Story 2. The gentle patter of rain against aged wooden shingles filled the evening air. As I sat in my grandmother's weathered rocking chair, wrapped in the soft warmth of her hand-knitted blanket. The old house creaked softly around me, its familiar sounds a comfort in the growing darkness. Through the window, I watched as the last traces of daylight faded, painting the misty landscape in shades of deep purple and blue. My grandmother had passed away 3 months ago, leaving me this house nestled at the edge of a small village, a place so old and remote that maps seem to have forgotten its name. The villagers themselves never spoke its name either, referring to it simply as here or home in hushed, reverential tones. The rain continued its gentle symphony as I sipped chamomile tea from my grandmother's favorite porcelain cup, its delicate floral pattern barely visible in the dim light of the antique lamp beside me. The soft yellow glow created dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, I could almost imagine her still here, telling me stories of the village's mysterious past. A subtle change in the air drew my attention, a slight shift in temperature perhaps, or a whisper of movement just beyond my peripheral vision. The rain seemed to pause for a heartbeat, and in that moment of silence, I heard it, the distant sound of bells, their gentle chiming carried on the evening breeze. It was strange. I had never heard bells in the 3 months I'd lived here, and I knew the village had no church. Setting down my tea, I moved closer to the window, drawn by the melodic sound. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could make out tiny points of light scattered throughout the village, like earthbound stars. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with the bells, creating a hypnotic display that made my eyelids feel heavy. I found myself thinking of the curious ways of the villagers, how they always seemed to know when it would rain, how they left small offerings of bread and honey on their windowsills during the new moon, how they never ventured out after sunset on certain days without carrying a blue candle. My grandmother had followed these customs too, though she never explained why. Her only response to my questions had been a gentle smile and the words, "Some things are felt rather than understood, dear one." The sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside drew me from my reverie. Through the rain-blurred window, I could make out a figure walking slowly past my house. Their lanterns swayed gently as they walked, casting a soft blue light that seemed to part the mist like a curtain. The sight was oddly peaceful, despite its strangeness. As I watched, more figures emerged from the mist, each carrying similar lanterns. They moved in a slow, graceful procession through the village streets, their feet making no sound despite the gravel. The bell sounds grew stronger, though I still couldn't locate their source. The air in the house felt thick with anticipation, like the moment before thunder follows lightning. My grandmother's journals lay on the side table, their leather covers worn smooth with age. I had been reading them gradually since her passing, discovering fragments of village life recorded in her elegant handwriting. Tonight, drawn by some inexplicable urge, I opened the most recent volume to a random page. "The lights return with the autumn rains," she had written. "They dance on nights when the veil grows thin, calling to those who know how to listen." The villagers say our ancestors chose this place because it was already a home to others, ones who walked these lands long before us. We learned to share the space, to live in harmony with what we cannot fully comprehend. The offerings we leave, the customs we keep. These are not superstitions, but a language of respect spoken through generations. A soft knock at my door made me look up from the journal. It was barely audible above the rain, yet somehow I knew it had come from the back door, the one that opened onto my grandmother's herb garden. The knocking came again, gentle and rhythmic, almost musical in its pattern. For a moment I sat perfectly still, wondering if I should answer. The rational part of my mind suggested caution, but something deeper, something that felt like my grandmother's gentle wisdom, told me there was nothing to fear. Rising from my chair, I walked slowly through the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the wooden floors. The back door's curtain was drawn, but through its thin fabric, I could see the soft blue glow of a lantern. My hand hesitated on the doorknob for just a moment before turning it. The door opened smoothly, without its usual creak, as if it too understood the importance of maintaining the evening's ethereal quiet. No one stood on the other side, but on the doorstep sat a small lantern, its blue flame steady despite the rain. Beside it lay a piece of paper, the edges curled slightly, but somehow completely dry. I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. "My dearest, if you're reading this, then you've begun to see what I always hoped you would. The village has chosen to show itself to you, as it did to me when I was young. Don't be afraid of what you don't understand. Some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than solved. The lantern is yours now, as is my place in this dance between worlds." I picked up the lantern, its warmth spreading through my fingers like a gentle embrace. The blue light seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and in that moment, I understood why my grandmother had loved this nameless village so deeply. It wasn't just a place. It was a threshold between the known and the unknown, where reality and dreams danced together in the rain. From the village came the sound of bells again, clearer now, like crystal chimes in the wind. The procession of lights continued their slow circuit through the streets, and now I could see that they were waiting for me. With my grandmother's lantern in hand, I stepped out into the rain. Strangely, though I could see the droplets falling around me, none seemed to touch my skin or the flame of my lantern. The village had never looked more beautiful than it did that night, wrapped in mist and starlit rain, the blue lanterns creating paths of light through the darkness. As I joined the procession, falling into step with the other figures, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. This was what my grandmother had wanted me to find here, not answers, but acceptance of the mystery itself. We walked through the village until dawn, our lanterns painting the mist with gentle light, our footsteps silent on the wet ground. When the first rays of sun began to pierce the darkness, the other figures slowly faded into the morning mist, leaving me standing alone on my grandmother's front porch. The lantern in my hand flickered once, then went out, though its warmth remained. Now as I sit in my grandmother's rocking chair each evening, watching the rain and waiting for the sound of bells, I understand that some places exist in the spaces between. between reality and dreams, between past and present, between what we know and what we feel. The village may have no name on any map, but it has written itself indelibly on my heart, just as it did on my grandmother's. The villagers still leave their offerings on windowsills, and now I do too. I carry a blue candle on certain nights, and I've learned to feel the rain coming in my bones. Sometimes, when the mist rolls in and the bells begin to chime, I think I see my grandmother's figure among the lantern bearers, her smile as gentle as ever. But I don't try to chase these glimpses or make sense of them anymore. Some things, as she always said, are meant to be felt rather than understood. And so I rock gently in her chair, wrapped in her blanket, watching the rain and listening for bells, knowing that in this nameless village, mystery isn't something to be solved. It's something to be embraced, like a warm lantern on a rainy night, guiding us home to places we never knew we belonged. Story 3. The soft patter of rain against my window had been my constant companion throughout the evening, its gentle rhythm creating a soothing backdrop to my thoughts. The old house creaked and settled around me, its wooden bones adjusting to the dampness of the autumn night. I sat in my favorite armchair, wrapped in the warm glow of a single reading lamp, letting my mind drift between the pages of an old leather-bound book and the hypnotic dance of shadows on the wall. My peaceful reverie was interrupted by a peculiar sound, the faint echo of footsteps, muffled yet distinct, seeming to descend from somewhere above. At first, I dismissed it as the natural settling of the house, but there was something about their steady rhythm that caught my attention. Step by step, they moved with purpose, as if someone were carefully making their way down a staircase. The curious thing was, I lived in a single-story home. The rain continued its gentle symphony against the window panes as I closed my book, marking my place with an old photograph I used as a bookmark. The warm light from my reading lamp cast a soft golden glow across the room, creating pools of amber that seemed to pulse gently with each distant footstep. The air had grown thick with anticipation, heavy with the scent of old books and the earthy perfume of rain-soaked soil drifting in through the slightly open window. Rising from my chair, I followed the sound, moving through the house with measured steps. The old hardwood floors whispered beneath my feet, their familiar creaks a counterpoint to the mysterious footsteps that continued their steady descent. The sound led me to my study, a room I had always found both comforting and slightly unsettling during the late hours. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines creating a tapestry of faded colors in the dim light. What drew my attention wasn't the books, however, but the corner of the room where my grandfather's antique desk stood. Behind it, where there had always been a solid wall, I now saw the faintest outline of what appeared to be a doorway. The wallpaper, aged and slightly yellowed, seemed to ripple slightly, as if disturbed by a gentle breath of air from behind it. The footsteps grew clearer now, each one distinct and measured. They seemed to be approaching this very spot, descending toward me from some impossible space beyond the wall. The sound of rain faded into the background as I stood transfixed, watching as the outline of the doorway became more defined with each passing moment. My hand reached out almost of its own accord, fingers brushing against the wallpaper. It felt cool to the touch, with an unusual texture that seemed to shift beneath my fingertips. The footsteps paused, and in that moment of silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and calm despite the strangeness of the situation. As I pressed my palm flat against the wallpaper began to peel away, not in torn shreds, but as if it were a curtain being drawn aside. Behind it, step by step, a staircase revealed itself, ascending into darkness. The stairs were made of a material I couldn't quite identify, neither wood nor stone, but something that seemed to absorb the light from my room rather than reflect it. The air that drifted down from the staircase carried with it the scent of time itself, musty and ancient, yet somehow fresh, like the first breath of wind after a long winter. Each step was perfectly formed, yet seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, as if they couldn't quite decide on their final shape. I found myself taking the first step without conscious thought. The surface beneath my foot was solid, yet seemed to give slightly like moss-covered stone. The temperature dropped noticeably as I ascended, not uncomfortably so, but enough to raise goosebumps along my arms. The sounds of the rain and the familiar creaks of my house grew distant, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As I climbed higher, each step bringing me further into the impossible space, I noticed that the darkness ahead wasn't complete. Tiny points of light, like distant stars, seemed to float in the void. They moved in slow, graceful patterns, as if dancing to music I couldn't quite hear. The light they cast was minimal, yet somehow I could see each step clearly as I approached it. The staircase curved gently as it rose, though I couldn't tell if it was turning left or right. The usual rules of geometry seemed to hold little sway in this space. I had the distinct impression that I was climbing both up and in, toward some central point that existed outside of normal space. After what could have been minutes or hours, I noticed the steps beginning to fade. Not ending abruptly, but gradually becoming less substantial, more like suggestions of steps than physical objects. The star-like lights grew more numerous, their dance more intricate. The air here felt charged with potential, as if thoughts themselves might take physical form. I paused on what felt like the last solid step, looking ahead into the space where the staircase dissolved into nothingness. The points of light swirled before me, and in their pattern, I began to see shapes forming, images that seemed both familiar and impossible. I saw my house from angles that couldn't exist, rooms that I knew weren't there, and spaces that seemed to fold in on themselves. A soft voice carried on air that shouldn't have existed in this place, whispered words I could almost understand. They reminded me of the stories my grandmother used to tell, tales of places that existed between spaces, of doors that opened only under certain circumstances, of staircases that led to everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood there, balanced between the solid step beneath my feet and the void before me, feeling no fear, only a profound sense of wonder. The lights continued their dance, and I realized they were showing me possibilities. All the paths not taken, all the doors not opened, all the questions not asked. Time seemed to lose its meaning in this place. I could have been standing there for moments or for years, watching the lights weave their stories in the darkness. The air around me vibrated with potential, each breath filling me with a deeper understanding of something I couldn't quite grasp. Eventually, I felt a gentle tug, like a thread being pulled through fabric, drawing me back down the staircase. The descent was like watching a dream fade upon waking, each step seeming less substantial than the last, the star-like lights growing dimmer, the strange geometries of the space slowly resolving themselves back into the familiar dimensions of my study. When I found myself standing once again before the wall, the doorway was gone, the wallpaper undisturbed. The rain continued its gentle pattern against the windows, and my reading lamp cast the same warm glow across the room. Everything was exactly as it had been, yet somehow fundamentally different. I returned to my armchair, picking up the book I had set aside. The photograph I had used as a bookmark caught my eye. An old black and white image of my grandmother standing in front of her childhood home. For the first time, I noticed a doorway behind her, partially hidden by climbing vines, and what might have been the beginning of a staircase disappearing into shadow. Now, on quiet rainy nights when the house settles around me, I sometimes hear those footsteps again, descending from above. Sometimes I follow them, and sometimes I simply listen, letting the sound of those impossible steps blend with the rain. The staircase is always there, hidden behind the everyday world, waiting for those who know how to look for it. Where it leads, I'm still not certain, but I've come to understand that some questions are more valuable than their answers. The steps to nowhere, I've learned, often lead to the most interesting somewhere. A place that exists in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between raindrops, in the moment between sleeping and waking. And sometimes on particularly quiet nights, I can still see those distant lights dancing behind my closed eyelids, telling stories of all the staircases yet to be climbed, all the doorways yet to be discovered, and all the mysteries that wait patiently in the corners of our familiar worlds. Story 4. The autumn wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the crisp scent of fallen leaves and morning frost. What struck me as peculiar, however, was how the tall pines stood completely still, their branches rigid against the purple twilight sky. Nature seemed to hold its breath, creating an unsettling contrast between the moving air that caressed my face and the strange stillness of the forest before me. I had been walking these trails for years, documenting the changing seasons through my camera lens. The forest had always been my sanctuary, a place where time seemed to flow differently, where the steady rhythm of nature brought peace to my thoughts. But tonight, something felt different. The familiar path that wound through the ancient trees appeared somehow altered, though I couldn't quite explain how. The light was fading faster than usual, filtering through the canopy in weak, golden streams that barely reached the forest floor. My footsteps fell silently on the carpet of pine needles, each step releasing the subtle fragrance of decomposing vegetation. The air grew heavier with moisture, and I could taste the metallic hint of approaching rain on my tongue. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed how the usual symphony of forest sounds had changed. The typical rustling of small animals in the underbrush was absent, replaced by an almost musical humming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was so faint that I had to stop moving to hear it clearly, a low vibration that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The trees around me stood like sentinels, their bark appearing darker and more textured than I remembered. I reached out to touch the nearest trunk, expecting the rough sensation of pine bark, but instead felt an unusual warmth beneath my fingers. The tree's surface seemed to pulse ever so slightly, like the gentle throb of a sleeping creature's heartbeat. My camera hung heavily around my neck, and I lifted it to capture the strange quality of light filtering through the motionless branches. Through the viewfinder, I noticed something even more bizarre. Tiny points of luminescence scattered throughout the forest, barely visible to the naked eye, but clearly present in the digital display. They floated between the trees like suspended fireflies, though it was far too cold for such insects. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more pronounced these anomalies became. The ground beneath my feet felt somehow softer, more yielding, as if I were walking on the surface of a massive living organism. The air grew thicker, carrying an unfamiliar sweetness that reminded me of honey and old books. I came across a clearing I had never seen before, though I was certain I had photographed every inch of these woods. The space was perfectly circular, ringed by trees that seemed to lean inward ever so slightly, their branches creating a natural dome overhead. In the center stood a single tree, different from all the others. Its bark was pale, almost white, and seemed to shimmer with an inner light. As I approached the pale tree, the humming I had noticed earlier grew stronger. It resonated through my chest, a frequency that felt both soothing and slightly disorienting. The air around the tree appeared to ripple, like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt, though the evening was cool. I raised my camera again, hoping to capture this extraordinary sight, but the display showed only static. When I lowered the camera, I noticed something even more remarkable. Small droplets of what looked like amber were seeping from the tree's bark, catching the last rays of twilight and transforming them into drops of liquid gold. The rational part of my mind suggested I should leave, return home before darkness fell completely. Yet I felt drawn to this strange tree, compelled by a curiosity that overcame my usual caution. I reached out to touch one of the amber droplets, and as my finger made contact, a wave of sensation washed over me. Images flooded my mind, the forest as it had been centuries ago, the same trees but younger, more vigorous. I saw seasons pass in seconds, felt the rush of countless storms, experienced the slow, patient growth of roots extending deep into the earth. Most remarkably, I sensed a vast network of connections, invisible threads linking every tree in the forest in a complex web of communication and shared consciousness. The vision passed as quickly as it had come, leaving me dizzy and breathless. The humming had grown louder, and now I could distinguish patterns within it, like a language just beyond my understanding. The trees around the clearing seemed to have drawn closer, though I knew that was impossible. As darkness settled over the forest, the pale tree began to emit a soft glow, casting shadows that moved independently of any breeze. The amber droplets had multiplied, creating patterns on the bark that reminded me of constellations. The air was thick with that strange, sweet scent, and I found my thoughts becoming increasingly difficult to organize. I decided it was time to leave, though part of me wanted to stay and unravel this mystery. As I turned to go, I noticed my footprints in the soft earth were slowly filling themselves in, as if the ground were a living thing healing its wounds. The path I had followed seemed less distinct now. The landmarks I usually used to navigate had somehow shifted. The journey out of the forest took longer than it should have, and with each step I felt as though the trees were watching me, not with malice, but with an ancient, patient curiosity. The humming followed me, growing fainter as I approached the forest's edge, but never completely fading. When I finally emerged from the tree line, the normal sounds of the world rushed back. Distant traffic, the call of night birds, the rustle of wind through moving branches. I turned to look back at the forest one last time and saw only darkness between the trees, though I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of that pale, luminescent bark far in the distance. That night, as I reviewed the photos on my camera, I found most of them were corrupted, showing only abstract patterns of light and shadow. But one image remained clear: the circular clearing with its ring of leaning trees. In the photograph, the pale tree appeared normal, unremarkable even. Yet when I look closely, I can see tiny points of light scattered throughout the frame, like stars fallen to earth. I've returned to the forest many times since then, but I've never found that clearing again. The trees move normally now, swaying in the wind as they always did before. Yet sometimes, when the light is just right and the wind dies down, I catch that faint, familiar humming. In those moments, I understand that I glimpsed something ancient and mysterious, a secret the forest chose to share and then reclaim. The amber droplet I touched left a small mark on my finger, a tiny spiral pattern that glows faintly in the darkness. On quiet nights, I sometimes feel a gentle pulling sensation, as if the forest is calling me back. And when I dream of still trees and golden light, of a vast consciousness that moves with the patience of centuries, and of messages written in a language of light and shadow that I almost, but not quite, understand. Perhaps the forest is waiting for me to return, to learn its language more fully. Or perhaps it simply offered a momentary glimpse into a world that exists alongside our own, visible only when the light falls just so and the trees stand perfectly still. Either way, I know the forest holds more secrets than I could ever uncover in a lifetime, and I've made peace with that mystery. Now, when I walk other forests, I pay closer attention to the spaces between the trees, to the quality of silence in the deep woods, to the patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I catch a hint of that sweet, strange scent, carried on a wind that moves the air but not the branches, reminding me that there are still places in the world where magic lingers, patient and ancient, waiting to be discovered by those who know how to look. Story 5. The autumn wind carried whispers through the branches of the old trees, their bare limbs reaching toward a pewter sky heavy with the promise of evening snow. I had always found peace in walking these woodland paths as daylight faded, but tonight something felt different in the way the air moved around me, and how the dried leaves skittered across my path like nervous creatures seeking shelter. The familiar crunch of frost-covered grass beneath my boots provided a gentle rhythm to my thoughts as I made my way deeper into the woods. My breath formed delicate clouds that danced and dissolved in the failing light. The scent of pine needles and wood smoke from distant chimneys wrapped around me like a comfortable blanket. Yet there was another scent too, something older, earthier, that seemed to emerge from the very soil beneath my feet. My weekly walks had become a ritual over the past few months, a way to clear my mind after long days spent indoors. The trees had become like old friends, their twisted shapes familiar companions in my solitude. But as the days had grown shorter and winter had begun its slow approach, I had noticed subtle changes in these woods. The silence had deepened, becoming almost tangible, like a presence that walked beside me. Tonight, that presence felt stronger than ever. As I paused to adjust my scarf, a sound drifted through the growing darkness. Something between a sigh and a song, so faint I might have imagined it. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the forest itself were humming an ancient lullaby. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the deepening twilight, and listened. The bare branches swayed gently overhead, their movement creating strange patterns against the darkening sky. In the spaces between the trees, shadows gathered like pools of ink, deep and still. The air grew colder, and I pulled my coat tighter around myself, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The song, if that's what it was, seemed to be calling me forward. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed how the trees had changed. Their bark appeared different in the fading light, darker, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. The dried leaves that carpeted the ground no longer crunched beneath my feet, but whispered, as if sharing secrets in a language just beyond my understanding. The song grew slightly clearer, though still maddeningly faint. It reminded me of wind chimes heard from a great distance, or perhaps the sound of crystal glasses being played with wet fingers. There was a melody there, hauntingly beautiful, yet impossible to grasp fully. Each time I thought I had caught its pattern, it would shift and change, like water slipping through my fingers. I came to a small clearing where the trees stood in a perfect circle, their bare branches reaching toward each other like ancient hands frozen in an eternal dance. In the center of the clearing, a single tree stood apart from the others. Unlike its companions, this tree still held onto a few withered leaves that trembled in the evening air without any apparent breeze. The song seemed strongest here, and as I approached the central tree, I noticed how its bark spiraled up the trunk in patterns that reminded me of musical notes written in an unknown script. I reached out to touch it, my fingers hovering just above its surface. The air between my hand and the bark felt alive with static electricity, making the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. Just before my fingers made contact, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a shower of dead leaves that swirled around me in a perfect spiral. The song swelled for a moment, becoming almost clear enough to understand. In that brief instant, I felt as if I stood on the threshold of comprehending something vast and ancient. a secret that the withered trees had been keeping since the beginning of time. The moment passed, and the wind died down, but the song lingered in the air like the after-image of a dream. I noticed that my hand was now resting against the tree's bark, though I couldn't remember completing the movement to touch it. The texture beneath my fingers was smooth and cool, unlike any tree I had ever touched before. It felt almost like polished stone, yet it yielded slightly to my touch, as if it were breathing. As darkness continued to gather around me, I became aware of a subtle change in the clearing. The trees that formed the circle seemed to have drawn closer, though I knew this was impossible. Their branches now overlapped overhead, creating a natural dome that framed a small patch of purple-gray sky. The last remnants of daylight filtered through this canopy, casting intricate shadows that moved and shifted like living things. I should have felt afraid, standing alone in the growing darkness with that strange song echoing through the trees. Yet instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if I had finally found something I had been searching for without knowing it. The song had become part of my breathing, part of my heartbeat, as natural as the wind through the branches or the slow decay of autumn into winter. Time seemed to lose its meaning in that clearing. I could have been standing there for minutes or hours, listening to the song of the withered trees. The cold no longer bothered me, and the darkness felt like a comfortable embrace. In that strange twilight state between waking and dreaming, I began to understand that the trees were not simply making music. They were telling stories. They spoke of seasons long past, of summers filled with green light, and winters buried in endless white. They whispered of the countless feet that had walked these paths before me, of secrets buried beneath their roots, and of dreams that had taken flight from their branches. Each withered leaf that fell was a word in their endless narrative, each creaking branch a pause between sentences. As the last light faded from the sky, I noticed something extraordinary. Tiny points of light had begun to appear in the bark of the trees, like stars emerging at dusk. They pulsed gently in rhythm with the song, creating patterns that mirrored the constellations overhead. The central tree seemed to glow from within, its light so subtle that I had to look at it sideways to see it at all. I don't remember deciding to leave the clearing that night. Perhaps the trees themselves told me it was time to go. Or maybe some deep instinct warned me that one could listen to their song for too long. As I made my way back through the darkened woods, the melody followed me, growing fainter with each step until it was just barely audible above the sound of my footsteps. The next day, I tried to find the clearing again. I walked the same paths, followed the same landmarks, but the circle of trees remained elusive. Sometimes on my evening walks, I catch fragments of that song carried on the wind, or glimpse patterns in the bark that seem to shift and change when I look directly at them. The withered trees keep their secrets well, revealing them only to those who know how to listen. Even now, months later, I often find myself pausing during my walks, closing my eyes and listening for that ethereal melody. On particularly quiet evenings, when the wind moves just right through the branches, I can almost hear it, that ancient song of the withered trees, calling me back to their clearing. And sometimes, in those moments between sleeping and waking, I wonder if the trees are still singing their songs in that hidden place, waiting for someone else who knows how to listen to their ancient tales. Story 6. The soft patter of rain against aged window panes filled the evening air as I made my way along the winding forest road. My footsteps were hushed by the carpet of fallen pine needles beneath my feet, and the gathering mist wrapped around me like a gentle shroud. The journey had been long, and my tired muscles yearned for rest. As twilight descended, the forest seemed to whisper ancient secrets through its swaying branches. Through the growing darkness, a warm glow caught my eye. a beacon of golden light filtering through trees ahead. As I drew closer, the silhouette of an old inn emerged from the misty veil. Its weathered wooden walls and steep pitched roof spoke of countless years standing sentinel in these woods. A hand-painted sign creaked softly in the evening breeze, the Solitary Traveler's Inn. The name struck me as peculiar, yet somehow fitting for this remote haven. The windows cast warm rectangles of light onto the wet ground, and wisps of smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth and comfort within. My weary feet carried me to the heavy wooden door, its brass handle worn smooth by the touch of countless hands before mine. A small brass bell chimed gently as I stepped inside, its clear tones seeming to linger in the air longer than it should. The interior was bathed in the amber glow of old oil lamps, their flames dancing and casting ever-shifting shadows on the wood-paneled walls. The air held the comforting scent of burning cedar mixed with something sweeter, perhaps lavender or sage, and underneath it all, the subtle mustiness that spoke of age and history. The front desk was crafted from rich mahogany, its surface bearing the marks and scratches of time. Behind it stood no one, yet a leather-bound guest book lay open, its pages blank, save for a single entry written in elegant script. "Welcome, weary traveler, your room awaits." The ink still appeared wet, glistening in the lamplight. A brass key rested beside the book, attached to a wooden tag marked with the number 7. As I lifted it, its weight felt substantial in my palm, as if it carried more than just metal and wood. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended to the second floor, each step releasing the faintest scent of old wood and beeswax polish. The hallway stretched before me, lined with identical doors, their brass numbers catching the light of wall-mounted lamps. The carpet beneath my feet was worn but clean, its pattern of intricate vines and flowers still visible despite the years. As I walked, I could have sworn I heard the soft sound of a piano playing somewhere distant, though it seemed to fade away when I tried to focus on it. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door opened without a sound. The room within was furnished simply but elegantly. A 4-poster bed with crisp white linens, a wooden writing desk beneath a window, and a comfortable-looking armchair positioned near a small fireplace where flames already danced, though I hadn't heard anyone preparing the room. I set my travel bag down and moved to the window, watching as raindrops traced lazy patterns down the glass. The forest beyond was now cloaked in darkness, but occasionally I thought I saw tiny lights moving among the trees, like distant lanterns carried by unseen hands. When I blinked, they were gone. The bed called to me with its promise of rest, but first I decided to refresh myself. The bathroom was small but immaculate, with a clawfoot tub and a porcelain sink. The mirror above the sink reflected my tired face, but for a moment, just the briefest instant, I thought I saw another face behind mine, smiling warmly. When I turned, of course, I was alone. As I prepared for sleep, I noticed small details that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The pattern in the wallpaper appeared to rearrange itself in my peripheral vision. The shadows cast by the fireplace never quite matched the movement of the flames. And sometimes, very faintly, I could hear what sounded like distant conversation or laughter, though it always faded to silence when I tried to listen more carefully. I slipped beneath the covers, finding them perfectly warm, as if they had been recently heated. The pillow held the subtle scent of lavender, and as I lay there, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace despite the strangeness of my surroundings. The rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, and the fire crackled softly in the grate. Just as sleep began to claim me, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway, passing by my door with unhurried purpose. They were accompanied by the quiet humming of what seemed to be an old lullaby, though I couldn't quite place the melody. Part of me wanted to rise and look, but my limbs felt wonderfully heavy, and the bed held me in its comfortable embrace. Throughout the night, I drifted in and out of dreams that felt more like memories, though they weren't my own. I saw the inn in different seasons through different years. I saw other travelers, their clothes and manners speaking of different eras, each finding refuge within these walls. Their faces were peaceful, content, as if they too had found exactly what they needed here. When morning came, I awoke to sunlight filtering through lace curtains I hadn't noticed the night before. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, yet the room remained comfortably warm. On the writing desk, I found a cup of tea still steaming, though I had heard no one enter. Beside it lay a note written in the same elegant script from the guest book. "We trust you slept well. Your breakfast awaits below when you're ready." As I dressed, I couldn't help but notice that my clothes felt fresher than they should have, as if they had been carefully pressed while I slept. The mirror reflected a face that looked more rested than I had felt in years, though something in my eyes seemed different, as if I now shared some secret with the old inn and its unseen caretakers. The hallway appeared shorter in the morning light, though I was certain I counted the same number of doors. As I descended the stairs, the smell of fresh bread and coffee drew me toward what I assumed was the dining room. Yet when I reached the bottom, I found myself back in the entrance hall. The front desk stood empty, the guest book closed, my entry from the previous night nowhere to be seen. I searched for the dining room, following the enticing aromas, but each door I opened led me back to the entrance hall, until finally I understood. It was time to leave. My hunger had somehow faded, replaced by a profound sense of contentment that seemed to fill me from within. The morning air was crisp and clean as I stepped outside, the forest fresh from the night's rain. Looking back at the inn, I noticed details that had been hidden in the previous night's darkness. The way the architecture seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding trees, as if the building had grown from the forest itself. The sign still creaked gently, but now I understood why it was called the Solitary Traveler's Inn. Each guest's experience was theirs alone, unique and personal, like a dream shaped by their deepest needs. As I walked away along the forest path, I felt the weight of the brass key in my pocket, though I was certain I had left it in the room. When I reached to touch it, my fingers found nothing but empty fabric, yet the weight of it lingered like a phantom presence. I turned back one last time, but the inn had vanished, leaving only trees and morning mist. To this day, I cannot say with certainty whether I dreamed it all. Yet sometimes, on quiet nights when rain taps against my window, I catch the faintest scent of lavender and cedar, and I feel that same profound peace that I found at the Solitary Traveler's Inn. And sometimes, in the moment between waking and sleeping, I hear that distant lullaby, calling like a promise of rest to weary travelers who might find themselves on a misty forest road in need of shelter for the night. Each time I travel those woods, I search for the warm glow of the inn's windows through the trees, though I've never found it again. But I know it's there, waiting, perhaps visible only to those who truly need its particular brand of comfort and mystery. And sometimes I wonder if somewhere in that leather-bound guest book, my name still shimmers in wet ink, welcoming the next solitary traveler who finds their way to its door. Story 7. In the gentle embrace of an autumn evening, I found myself drawn to the peculiar basement door in my grandmother's Victorian house. The old wooden boards of the floor whispered softly beneath my feet as I approached, their aged surface worn smooth by decades of careful steps. The brass doorknob caught the warm light of my antique reading lamp, casting a subtle golden glow that seemed to pulse with an inner life of its own. The house had always held its secrets close, like a collector guarding precious artifacts. Since inheriting it 3 months ago, I had spent my evenings exploring its quiet corners, each room filled with the lingering scent of old books and lavender sachets that grandmother had loved so dearly. But the basement had remained unopened, waiting patiently behind its heavy oak door. Tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the wind moved through the garden outside, creating a soft, melodic humming as it passed through the branches of the ancient maple tree. Or maybe it was the unusual quality of the light, which seemed to pool and gather in unexpected places, leaving deeper shadows in its wake. The key to the basement door was cold in my palm, its intricate pattern pressing gently against my skin. As I slipped it into the lock, the mechanism responded with a series of delicate clicks, each one resonating through the empty hallway like distant wind chimes. The door opened without resistance, revealing the first few steps of a wooden staircase that descended into darkness. The air that drifted up from below carried an unfamiliar scent, not the musty dampness one might expect, but something closer to the crisp freshness of morning dew on grass, mixed with an odd metallic note that reminded me of the way the air feels just before a thunderstorm. I reached for the light switch, but the soft click yielded nothing. The darkness remained undisturbed. Returning to my study, I retrieved my grandmother's old brass oil lamp, its polished surface reflecting fragments of lamplight like scattered stars. The wick caught easily, and soon a warm, steady flame cast a comfortable circle of light around me. With the lamp held before me, I began my descent. The staircase was unlike anything I had expected in a Victorian basement. Each step was made of a dark wood I couldn't identify, polished to a soft sheen that seemed to absorb and reflect light in equal measure. The craftsmanship was exquisite, no nails visible, each board fitting perfectly against its neighbors. As I descended, I noticed that the walls were covered not in the expected rough stone or brick, but in panels of the same mysterious wood, each one carved with subtle patterns that seemed to shift and change in the lamplight. 17 steps down, I noticed something peculiar. The temperature, which should have grown cooler, remained perfectly constant. The air moved around me in gentle currents, carrying that same fresh metallic scent. More striking was the acoustic quality of the space. Each of my footsteps produced a sound that seemed to travel both up and down, as if the staircase continued far deeper than a normal basement should allow. At the 23rd step, I paused. The light from my lamp no longer revealed the bottom of the staircase, despite the fact that I should have reached the basement floor by now. Instead, the steps continued downward, maintaining their perfect craftsmanship and gentle curve. The carved patterns on the walls had become more pronounced, suggesting shapes that almost resolved into recognizable forms before flowing back into abstract designs. I found myself counting the steps as I descended. 34, 42, 57. The quality of the darkness ahead had changed, becoming somehow more substantial, as if it were gathering itself like heavy velvet curtains. The air continued to move, now carrying whispers that might have been echoes of my own breathing, or perhaps something else entirely. At step 73, I discovered the first of the photographs. It was set into the wall as if it had grown there, protected behind a piece of glass that was cool to the touch. In the lamplight, I could see it clearly. A black and white image of a young woman in Victorian dress, standing at what appeared to be the top of this very staircase. Her expression was serene, almost expectant, as she gazed down into the darkness below. The craftsmanship of the frame matched the woodwork perfectly, as if it had been carved from the same piece. More photographs followed, one every 7 steps. Each showed the same woman, descending the staircase, her expression growing more peaceful, more enlightened with each image. In some of them, I could have sworn her dress seemed to move slightly, as if caught in a gentle breeze, but when I looked more closely, the images were perfectly still. At step 108, I found the first of my grandmother's journals. It rested on a small shelf that protruded from the wall, bound in leather that matched the color of the woodwork exactly. Opening it, I recognized her elegant handwriting, though the words themselves seemed to resist my understanding, flowing across the page in patterns that mirrored the carved designs on the walls. The deeper I descended, the more I began to notice subtle changes in my perception. The light from my lamp seemed to extend further ahead, yet paradoxically revealed less. The darkness beyond its reach had taken on a quality that suggested depth and movement, like looking into a deep pool of water. The whispers in the air had become more distinct, though still maddeningly unclear. I lost count of the steps somewhere after 200, though I continued to mark my progress by the photographs and journals that appeared at regular intervals. The woman in the images had begun to change in subtle ways. Her dress seemed to flow more freely, her hair moved in an unseen wind, and her eyes held a knowledge that seemed to look back at me with growing recognition. Time became fluid, measured only by my footsteps and the steady flame of my lamp. The air moved more purposefully now, carrying with it fragments of music so beautiful and strange that I felt tears gathering in my eyes. The carved patterns on the walls had begun to tell a story, though whether it was moving forward or backward, I couldn't tell. At some point, it might have been minutes or hours into my descent, I realized that the wood beneath my feet had begun to feel less like wood and more like something alive. Each step responded to my weight with a subtle warmth, as if welcoming me deeper into whatever mystery lay below. The walls had developed a faint luminescence, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The woman in the photographs had changed completely now. In each new image, she seemed more ethereal, her form becoming one with the strange light that surrounded her. Her eyes held secrets that I felt I almost understood, each photograph bringing me closer to some profound revelation that hovered just beyond my grasp. I don't know how long I've been descending. The lamp in my hand never seems to need refilling, its flame burning with a steady light that feels more like a companion than a tool. The air around me is filled with whispers that almost form words, and music that almost resolves into familiar melodies. The darkness ahead continues to beckon, promising answers to questions I haven't yet learned to ask. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of movement in the photographs. A smile that wasn't there before, a hand raised in greeting or warning. The journals I pass now contain writings that seem to shift between my grandmother's hand and something older, something that speaks of depths and heights beyond normal human understanding. The staircase continues its gentle spiral downward, each step both an ending and a beginning. I've begun to understand that this descent is more than just a physical journey. The patterns on the walls have started to make sense, revealing fragments of a story that might be mine, or might belong to everyone who has ever sought answers in the dark. I know I should feel afraid, or at least concerned about how far I've come from the world above, but there's a peace in this descent, a rightness that feels like coming home to a place I've never been. The air carries the scent of possibilities, and the darkness ahead feels less like an absence of light, and more like a different kind of illumination. Perhaps I'll reach the bottom eventually, or perhaps the journey itself is the destination. For now, I continue downward, one step at a time, guided by the steady flame of my lamp and the whispered promises of the abyss below. Each step brings new mysteries, new patterns in the wood, new photographs that might be windows or mirrors. The last photograph I passed showed the Victorian woman looking back over her shoulder, a gentle smile on her face. For a moment, I could have sworn she winked at me, but when I looked again, she was as still as ever, her eyes holding secrets that I'm only beginning to understand. And so I descend deeper into this mystery that my grandmother left for me. The staircase continues, the The darkness beckons, and somewhere below, I sense answers waiting to be discovered. Whether they're the answers I seek or something entirely unexpected remains to be seen. But for now, the journey itself is enough. Each step a revelation, each breath a prayer, each moment a step closer to understanding the true nature of this endless descent into wonder. Story 8. The first thing I noticed that autumn evening was how the air felt different, thicker somehow, as if reality had gained weight. The gentle patter of rain against the windows created a soothing backdrop to my thoughts as I sat in my grandmother's old reading chair, surrounded by the familiar scents of leather-bound books and Earl Grey tea. The house had always held its secrets, passed down through generations, along with the antique furniture and dusty photographs. But tonight something felt distinctly different. The rain outside painted shifting patterns on the worn hardwood floors, its rhythm matching the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. A soft amber glow from the vintage table lamp cast long shadows across the room, making the usual shapes of furniture seem somehow unfamiliar in the gathering darkness. The warmth of my teacup provided comfort against the slight chill that had begun to creep in through the old window frames. It started with the mirror, the ornate Victorian piece that had hung above the fireplace for as long as anyone could remember. In its silvered surface, I caught a glimpse of movement that shouldn't have been there. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the way one often does when confronted with something that defies explanation. But as I watched, the reflection began to shift, like ripples moving across a still pond. The house creaked and settled around me, its old bones adjusting to the cooling evening air. Yet beneath those familiar sounds, I began to notice something else, a subtle humming, barely perceptible but constant, like the distant song of crystal glasses being played with wet fingers. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the rain's gentle percussion. Setting down my tea, I approached the mirror with measured steps, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity that overshadowed any apprehension. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the space between myself and the mirror had become dense with possibility. The humming grew slightly stronger, though it remained gentle enough that I might have imagined it. In the mirror's surface, my reflection appeared normal at first glance, but there was something subtle about the way it moved that felt wrong. The timing was off by the smallest fraction of a second, like watching a video with slightly desynchronized audio. The room reflected behind me seemed deeper somehow, the corners stretching just a bit further than they should have. I reached out, my fingers hovering inches from the cool glass. The surface rippled again, like mercury responding to an unseen force. In that moment, I noticed other small details that had escaped my attention before. The books on the shelves in the reflection were bound in colors I'd never seen before, their titles written in scripts that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The grandfather clock's steady ticking seemed to slow, each second stretching longer than the last. In the reflection, I could see that its hands moved counterclockwise, though when I turned to look at the actual clock, everything appeared normal. The dissonance between what I saw directly and what appeared in the mirror created a gentle vertigo, not unpleasant but deeply intriguing. As evening deepened into night, more subtle differences began to emerge. The rain in the reflection fell upward, each drop rising from the ground to rejoin the clouds. The shadows cast by my lamp moved independently of the light source, dancing slowly across the walls like curious creatures exploring their environment. The air grew heavy with the scent of petrichor, but mixed with something else, an otherworldly fragrance that reminded me of star anise and ozone. I spent hours watching the mirror, noting each small divergence from reality. Sometimes in the deepest corners of the reflected room, I caught glimpses of shapes that seemed to watch back, not threatening, but filled with the same curious wonder I felt. They never fully emerged into view, remaining always at the edges of perception, like the phosphenes that dance behind closed eyelids. The humming had become a constant companion, its frequency shifting in response to my movements. When I stepped closer to the mirror, it would deepen, reverberating through my chest like the distant echo of a cathedral bell. When I moved away, it would lift into higher registers, becoming almost melodic. Throughout the night, the boundary between the real and the reflected seemed to grow increasingly fluid. Objects in the room began to cast double shadows, one following the normal rules of light, the other responding to some unseen illumination from within the mirror. The temperature would fluctuate gently, creating pockets of warmth and coolness that drifted through the room like invisible currents. At some point, I noticed that the books on my shelves had begun to whisper. It wasn't in any language I could understand, but rather in the soft susurration of pages turning themselves, spines creaking as they shifted slightly on their shelves. In the mirror, I could see the reflected books responding with their own mysterious movements, creating a quiet conversation between realities. The rain continued its gentle fall, but now each drop seemed to contain tiny worlds of its own. When I looked closely at the window panes, I could see miniature landscapes forming and dissolving in each bead of water. Forests of crystalline trees, mountains of microscopic minerals, oceans of liquid light. In the mirror, these same drops contained different visions, equally beautiful, but following laws of physics I couldn't quite comprehend. As midnight approached, marked by the grandfather clock's backwards moving hands in the mirror, the air began to feel like silk against my skin. Reality seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. The humming reached a resonance that made every molecule in the room vibrate in sympathy, though still soft enough to remain soothing rather than disturbing. I found myself settling back into the reading chair, watching as both the real room and its reflection began to blend in my perception. The boundaries between the two worlds became increasingly indistinct, like watercolors bleeding into each other on wet paper. Yet there was no fear in this dissolution, only a profound sense of peace and wonder. The mirror now seemed less like a barrier and more like a window, or perhaps a door. Through its surface, I could sense vast possibilities, infinite variations of reality existing simultaneously. The shapes at the edges of vision had grown more distinct, though they remained respectfully distant. They seemed to be studying me with the same fascination I had for their world, neither of us willing to disturb the delicate balance we had discovered. In the growing harmony between worlds, I began to understand something fundamental about the nature of reality. The mirror wasn't showing me another world. It was revealing the infinite layers that existed within our own, the countless possibilities that live in the spaces between moments. Every reflection was a glimpse into what might be, what could be, what was somewhere else. The rain began to ease, though its gentle rhythm remained, creating a bridge between the real and the reflected. The humming had become so much a part of the experience that I only noticed it when it changed, its frequencies shifting like the northern lights translated into sound. The air continued to thicken with possibility, each breath bringing with it the taste of other worlds. As dawn approached, the distinction between reality and reflection began to reassert itself, though not completely. The mirror's surface became more solid, the ripples less frequent, but something of the other world remained. The humming settled into a barely perceptible frequency, like a reminder of what I had witnessed. The grandfather clock resumed its normal movement, though sometimes, when viewed from certain angles, its hands still seemed to hesitate between moving forward and backward. The books quieted their whispering, but remained slightly different than I remembered, their colors deeper, their titles somehow more meaningful. Even now, as I sit in the growing morning light, I can feel the lingering presence of that other world. The mirror appears normal to casual observation, but I know that if I wait until the right moment, when the light falls just so, when the air grows thick with possibility, when the rain returns to paint its patterns on the windows, I might once again glimpse that infinite space between realities. The experience has left me with a profound sense of peace, an understanding that our world is far more wonderful and mysterious than we imagine. The boundary between what is real and what is reflected, I've learned, is far more permeable than we believe. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, if you listen carefully, you might still hear that gentle humming, a reminder that just beyond the surface of things, countless other worlds are waiting to be discovered. I've kept this experience to myself, knowing that others might not understand. But sometimes, when visitors come to the house, I notice them pausing before the mirror, their expressions curious and wondering. And I see in their eyes the same question I had that first night. What lies beyond the reflection? What worlds exist just beyond the surface of our own? The mirror keeps its secrets, revealing them only to those who take the time to look deeply enough, to those who are willing to sit quietly and wait for the moment when reality ripples like water and the boundaries between worlds grow thin. Story 9. The gentle drumming of rain against the window panes filled the old house with a soothing rhythm, like nature's own lullaby. I sat in my grandfather's weathered leather armchair, watching as shadows danced across the walls, cast by the flickering flames in the fireplace. The warmth from the hearth wrapped around me like a comfortable blanket, making my eyelids feel heavy with each passing moment. The house had always held a certain mystique, passed down through generations of my family. Its aged wooden floors whispered tales with every step, and the antique wallpaper seemed to hold countless secrets within its faded patterns. Tonight, though, something felt different about the familiar creaks and settling sounds that typically accompanied the evening hours. As I began to drift between consciousness and sleep, my attention was drawn to the sound of my own breathing, steady and deep. But there was something peculiar about it, something that made me pause and listen more intently. The rhythm of my breath seemed to have an echo, barely perceptible beneath the patter of raindrops, as if someone else's breathing was trying to synchronize with mine. I opened my eyes slowly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over the room. The firelight cast warm amber tones across the antique furniture, making the brass fixtures gleam softly. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked away steadily, its pendulum swinging in its eternal dance with time. Everything appeared normal, yet that subtle echo of breath persisted, like a whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. The rain continued its gentle symphony against the windows, creating patterns that reminded me of Morse code, as if nature itself was trying to communicate something important. I found myself focusing on these sounds, trying to decipher their hidden meaning, while the mysterious breathing continued its ghostly accompaniment to my own. Rising from the chair, I moved quietly through the room, my bare feet making contact with the cool wooden floor. Each board seemed to exhale beneath my weight, adding its voice to the nocturnal chorus. The house had always made sounds at night, but now every creak and groan carried new significance, as if the building itself was trying to tell me something. In the hallway, old photographs hung in their tarnished frames, their subjects watching me with eyes that seemed to follow my movement. I paused before a particular image, a sepia-toned portrait of my great-grandmother standing in this very house, her expression serene yet somehow knowing. The longer I looked at her face, the more I felt she was trying to convey something important across the decades that separated us. The breathing sound grew slightly more distinct as I approached the library. This room had always been my favorite, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the lingering scent of aged paper and leather bindings. Tonight, that familiar smell was accompanied by something else, a subtle fragrance that reminded me of spring flowers and morning dew, completely out of place on this autumn evening. Moonlight filtered through the rain-streaked windows, creating abstract patterns on the Persian rug. The breathing was clearer now, definitely not my own, yet it wasn't frightening. Instead, it carried a sense of peaceful familiarity, like the sound of waves lapping at a distant shore. I found myself drawn to one of the bookshelves, where a faint glow seemed to emanate from between the volumes. Running my fingers along the spines of the books, I felt a slight warmth emanating from one particular tome. My great-grandmother's journal, bound in soft brown leather and worn smooth by time. As I carefully pulled it from its resting place, the breathing sound seemed to pulse in harmony with the subtle luminescence that surrounded the book. The journal's pages were filled with elegant handwriting, the ink having faded to a warm sepia tone. As I began to read, the words seemed to float off the page, carrying with them the scent of those spring flowers I had noticed earlier. My great-grandmother wrote of the house's secrets, of the way it breathed with its inhabitants, of how it held memories within its walls like precious gems. She described nights much like this one, when the barrier between the ordinary and the extraordinary grew thin. According to her writings, the house itself was a keeper of memories, collecting the breath and thoughts of all who had lived within its walls. These memories would sometimes manifest as gentle echoes, reaching out to those who were willing to listen. The rain's rhythm changed, becoming softer, more melodic. The breathing sound now seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, harmonizing with the house's natural sounds in a way that made it impossible to distinguish where one ended and the other began. The air grew thick with the weight of countless memories, yet remained somehow fresh and invigorating. I continued reading, discovering that my great-grandmother had developed a deep connection with the house's mysterious nature. She wrote of conversations held in the language of creaking floorboards and tapping branches, of messages conveyed through the patterns of dust motes dancing in sunbeams. The house, she believed, was not just a structure of wood and stone, but a living repository of family history. As I turned each page, the breathing grew more synchronized with my own, until it became impossible to tell which was mine and which belonged to the house. The boundaries between past and present, between the physical and the ethereal, seemed to blur like watercolors bleeding into one another. The room filled with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. In one particular entry, my great-grandmother wrote of a night when she finally understood the true nature of the house's breathing. It wasn't just the echo of past inhabitants, but the very essence of family connections, maintaining their strength across generations. The breath was the thread that connected all of us who had called this place home, a gentle reminder that we were never truly alone within these walls. The grandfather clock's chimes resonated through the house, marking the midnight hour. With each toll, the breathing seemed to grow stronger, more present, until it filled the space like a tangible presence. Yet there was no fear in this phenomenon, only a deep sense of connection and belonging that seemed to reach across time itself. Setting the journal aside, I closed my eyes and simply listened. The breath of the house had become a meditation, a rhythm that connected me to every person who had ever walked these halls, sat in these rooms, or gazed out these windows. I could feel their presence not as ghosts or spirits, but as echoes of love and life that the house had carefully preserved. The rain began to fade, its rhythm growing fainter until it was barely more than a memory. The breathing, however, remained, steady, constant, comforting. I found myself breathing in perfect synchronization with it, each inhale drawing in not just air, but the essence of generations of family history. As dawn approached, the mysterious breathing gradually began to fade, merging once again with the house's usual nocturnal symphony. The first hints of morning light began to peek through the windows, casting long shadows across the library floor. The journal in my lap seemed to lose its subtle glow, becoming once again just an old book filled with fading words. Yet something had fundamentally changed in my perception of the house. The breathing hadn't really stopped. I had simply learned to recognize it as part of the house's natural rhythm. It was there in the settling of old wood, in the whisper of wind through cracks, in the gentle creaking of floorboards beneath my feet. I carefully returned the journal to its place on the shelf, noting how the spot seemed to welcome it back like an old friend. The morning light grew stronger, filling the room with a warm, golden glow that seemed to make the air itself shimmer with possibility. The house's breathing had become part of my own, a shared secret between the walls that had sheltered my family for generations and those who had called it home. As I made my way back to the leather armchair, now bathed in early morning light, I understood that the breath in the starless night had been more than just a mysterious occurrence. It was a reminder that some connections transcend time and space, that the boundaries between past and present are perhaps more permeable than we imagine. The house continued its gentle breathing, now barely noticeable beneath the growing sounds of dawn. But I knew it would always be there, waiting for quiet moments and rainy nights, ready to share its secrets with those who were willing to listen and breathe in harmony with the memories it held within its walls. Story 10. The soft patter of rain against leaves created a gentle symphony as I made my way along the winding forest path. Each drop seemed to whisper ancient secrets, their rhythmic cadence lulling my thoughts into a peaceful meditation. The air carried the rich scent of wet earth and pine needles, a natural perfume that filled my lungs with every breath. I had always found solace in these solitary walks, especially during the quiet hours when twilight painted the sky in gentle brushstrokes of lavender and deep blue. The forest had become my sanctuary, a place where time seemed to flow differently, where the modern world's chaos melted away into the timeless dance of nature. That evening, something felt different. The rain, which had been my constant companion for hours, began to ease, transforming into a delicate mist that hung in the air like a translucent veil. Through this ethereal curtain, I noticed a peculiar formation in the rocky hillside that I had never seen before. The mist seemed to part around it, as if nature itself wanted to reveal this hidden secret. Drawing closer, I realized it was the entrance to a cave, its mouth a perfect arch that appeared almost too symmetrical to be natural. The smooth stone surfaces caught what little light remained, creating subtle patterns that seemed to shift and change with each passing moment. The air flowing from the cave carried a strange warmth, unexpected in the cool evening air. Inside my backpack, my flashlight waited like a faithful companion. Its beam cut through the gathering darkness, revealing walls that seemed to shimmer with tiny crystals, each one catching and reflecting the light in mesmerizing patterns. The cave's entrance was wide enough to walk through comfortably, and the floor, though slightly damp, was surprisingly even. As I ventured deeper, the sound of the rain gradually faded, replaced by something else, a silence unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound, but rather a presence in itself, as if the silence had weight and substance. The air grew warmer, carrying a faint, sweet scent that reminded me of summer flowers and autumn leaves, an impossible combination that somehow felt right in this mysterious space. The tunnel began to wind gently downward, each curve revealing new wonders. The crystalline formations became more elaborate, creating delicate structures that resembled frozen waterfalls and ancient columns. My flashlight beam caught each facet, sending rainbow reflections dancing across the walls. The effect was hypnotic, almost dreamlike. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I continued my descent. The tunnel maintained its perfect proportions, never becoming too narrow or too wide. The air remained fresh and warm, carrying that strange, sweet scent that seemed to grow stronger with each step. Occasionally, I would pause to run my fingers along the wall, feeling the smooth, almost polished texture of the stone beneath my fingertips. After what could have been minutes or hours, I entered a vast chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the ceiling, but it revealed enough to take my breath away. The walls were covered in intricate patterns that seemed to flow and move in the shifting light. They reminded me of writing, but unlike any language I had ever seen. The symbols appeared to change when viewed from different angles, revealing new forms and shapes with each movement. In the center of the chamber stood a single column of crystal, rising from floor to ceiling. Unlike the other formations in the cave, this one emitted its own soft light, a gentle pulse that matched the rhythm of a beating heart. The light seemed to respond to my presence, growing slightly brighter as I approached, then dimming as I stepped back. As I stood there watching the play of light and shadow, I became aware of something else. The silence had deepened, but within it, I could almost hear something. Not sounds exactly, but impressions of sounds, like memories of music played long ago, or conversations just beyond the edge of hearing. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crystal column's light began to pulse in a different pattern, and I felt a gentle vibration through the soles of my feet. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift more rapidly now, creating patterns that drew my eyes and held them. I found myself swaying slightly, as if moved by an invisible current. Time continued its strange dance in this underground sanctuary. I could have sworn I saw shapes moving in the deeper shadows of the chamber, not threatening, but curious, like children peeking around a corner. When I turned to look directly at them, they would dissolve into the darkness, leaving only the impression of movement and the faintest whisper of laughter. The air grew thicker with that sweet, mysterious scent, and I felt my thoughts beginning to drift. The boundaries between reality and dreams became fluid, and I found myself remembering places I had never been and conversations I had never had. The crystal's light seemed to pulse in time with these phantom memories, creating a symphony of light and sensation. Gradually, I became aware that I should probably leave, though the thought filled me with an inexplicable sadness. As I turned to go, the light from the crystal column flickered in what almost seemed like a farewell. The patterns on the walls shifted one final time, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn they formed a message, clear and distinct, before dissolving back into their mysterious dance. The journey back seemed shorter, though I couldn't be sure if I was following the same path. The tunnel's twists and turns felt familiar, yet somehow different, as if the cave itself was constantly rearranging its geometry. The crystalline formations continued their silent light show, guiding me back toward the entrance. When I finally emerged, the forest was dark, but the rain had stopped completely. The stars had emerged, twinkling through gaps in the clouds like distant echoes of the crystal cave's light. The air felt different now, ordinary, lacking that strange, sweet scent that had filled the cave. I turned to look back at the entrance, and in the starlight, I could see that the perfect arch was still there, but something had changed. The opening seemed smaller somehow, more natural, as if the cave was slowly closing itself off from the outside world. The warm air that had flowed from it earlier had been replaced by the cool night breeze. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still feel the gentle vibration of the crystal column through my feet, still see the shifting patterns on the walls behind my closed eyelids. The silence of my bedroom seemed shallow compared to the profound quiet of the cave, and I found myself straining to hear those almost sounds that had filled the chamber. In the days that followed, I returned to the forest many times, following the same path I had taken that evening. Sometimes I found the cave entrance exactly where I remembered it. Other times it seemed to have moved, appearing in unexpected places along the hillside. But it was always there, waiting, its perfect arch inviting me to step once more into its mysteries. The crystal column still pulses with its gentle light, the patterns still dance on the walls, and the silence still holds its ancient secrets. But now, sometimes, when I stand in that vast chamber, I think I can almost understand the message hidden in those shifting symbols. Almost, but not quite, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. For in that eternal silence, in that space between understanding and mystery, I've found something more valuable than answers. I've found a place where wonder still exists, where the boundary between the real and the magical becomes as fluid as the mist that first led me to the cave's entrance. And in that place, in that perfect silence, I've discovered that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but simply experienced, again and again. Each visit revealing new wonders while keeping their deepest secrets forever just beyond our grasp.